This morning we want to talk about, well, it started off, I said climate change and all the issues around climate change. And then Dave gave me a bit of an education and the fact that climate change is really a symptom and not really the topic. And we kind of then went to, well, what's the real issue? And we kind of went back to the idea of creation. And how do we care for the world in which we live? And it might help you a little bit to understand why I'm asking Dave about this. Because some of you may just know him as the guy that stands up the front with the guitar. But he has an education. And I understand he learned a few things.
A little bit.
A little bit. Dave, just for the sake of people so then got an idea, what actually was your topic of research and study?
Okay, might be helpful to jump one step back from that. This whole idea of being an educated person. I left school at 16 with C's and D's in GCSE, which is about as average as you can get. And I had a moment in life at the age of 24, having been worked a printer and a chemical plant processor operator, so in factories and things like that, of going to Africa. And I just volunteered in Africa for a bit. I thought I'll do a few conservation projects, always liked conservation, or kind of nature, all that kind of stuff. And just got caught by this idea of how the whole system works together. This idea of ecology and how things work together. And coming back from that, and I'll tell you that slightly because at the time I was probably on the brink of losing my faith. Kind of was a bit fed up, kind of a bit down in the dumps about life and everything. And I remember me and my mum having it, who's gone out for Sunday school, thankfully, otherwise I'll fill up telling her. She said, well, what do you think about God anymore? And I kind of went, I'm not so sure anymore. And I prayed to God that night, went, I think I'm done with you, God. I think I'm done. And out of that, it kind of went, well, I'm not done with you, as a kind of thing. And out of that, really, that was the start of me becoming fascinated about God and his world. And I went into university as an ecology and conservation management degree. Sounds dead posh. Basically, we were building dry stone walls and things like that. And it was learning about the world around us. And I ended up being top of the class. From average C's to top of the class. To then kind of going, well, having all my lecturers telling me, you have to go and do a PhD. To which I then did in trees in the urban environment, which sounds dead exciting, doesn't it? It's about the most boring title in the world, in Manchester, where it rains most of the time. And that work really focused on how we can work with nature and alongside of trees specifically to try and make our world inhabitable in the years to come. So that becomes the link really to how probably the last decade and a half really, I've been fairly obsessed by this subject. This is the only time I've ever stood here, or sat here, without notes, because I spent about 15 years researching this, so we could go anywhere. But that's how I've ended here.
So my task this morning is to keep Dr. Dave in check.
Short.
And keep him on track. So thinking of getting kind of to the point of the discussion really, the first question I've got here is, what are we actually going to talk about? Or what is the issue we're talking about? Because when we were preparing for this, I said to Dave, it's all on the news all the time. Climate change this, climate change that, climate change the other. So Dave, what do you think is the problem, the issue that we as a society are trying to grapple with?
Okay, good question. That's big. Okay,
easy.
Yeah, I'm trying to condense that really a little bit. So climate change is happening. Okay, the world is getting hotter, and that is going to change the way. And I think we'll touch on it later more. But it's going to change the way that humanity interacts with the globe. Now, I'm going to caveat this. I'm going to sit here today and talk about stuff, and some of you may not agree with the outcomes. However, climate change has been debated for years and years and years. The key is, it is happening. Nobody debates that fact. It is happening. However, what the discussion has been is whether it's man-made or not. Climate change happens all the time. We've had ice ages. We've had periods where the world has been largely formless because of comets hitting the Earth and meteorites hitting the Earth and things like that. Climate change happens all the time. Okay, and that's why I kind of don't like that term. But is it human or not is the question. Recently, and I'm talking in the last 3 years, I think, maybe just pre-pandemic, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, finally concluded that there was no doubt now that it is man-made changes that are driving climate change. So the discussion really I find fascinating about that is what impact are we having and what is our response? So I think that's what we're discussing today.
Yeah, okay, so what in my head I'm saying, so what we're basically saying is human beings for the first time in history are the prime force that is bringing about change on a global scale.
Yeah, man, I like to use the word man as in the biblical sense, man. Human beings we'll go for though are the drivers of change that is destroying other things. So we've had mass extinctions in the past. We've had species, animals die out across the globe in the past. Okay? Again, theology. I'm going to use them words, dinosaurs. Debate. Okay? Whether or not you believe dinosaurs were just fossil evidence that's been left there as a guide away from the truth, or whether or not you do. There's lots of evidence, not just as far as the dinosaur, that mass extinctions happened before, but it's always been a result of natural change. So whether that be a meteorite hitting the earth or what it may be, this is the first time in history one of the things living on earth, i.e. human beings, is changing it and damaging it and actually changing the way the world works on a global scale.
Okay, so let's think a little bit more theologically.
Okay.
About man's place in this world. There's some interesting thoughts about our responsibility for this world. I think from our conversation, this is important in terms of unraveling the question of responsibility, is to first of all ask the question, what's our place here? So biblically, how do you understand, or how would you frame our responsibility as human beings created in the image of God, placed on this earth? What is our responsibility in terms of the world?
Okay, so it's helpful probably at this point for me to frame, I believe that God created the world. I believe that God created all things in it. I may disagree with some of you on how long that took. I may disagree with some of you how we got here in terms of how God shaped that and moved that, and I may agree wholeheartedly with others of you. But I believe we got here because God placed us here. I believe we are built in God's image, and I believe that God placed us here, and when we read the Bible, God is here for companionship with God. We are there to be with God. And there's a very interesting line in the Bible, and I should have wrote the reference down, but I can find it because it's on page 1 or 2. In there that there's a debate over the interpretation of the word, which probably falls more into your category. Yeah. We were given dominion, and dominion has, from various sources, has various interpretations and in various translations. And the one that I settle with, and the one that I'm most happy with, because it's probably the one that most people have ended up on, is we are here as custodians of the earth, or of Eden, as was. Let's not say the earth yet. That we were given the responsibility of this planet created by God, made by God, that we were here to enjoy, that we're here to have interact with, to have fun in, to play in, to eat from, to live in, all those things. We were given the responsibility of being custodians. And custodian is very different to someone with dominion. Custodians are given something. They're handed something. One day we're meant to hand it back. Dominion kind of says this, we can do what we want with it. And there are preachers out there that will say that. There are sermons out there that will say this world is temporary. This is for us to use how we want, because this world is going to pass away. I believe custodians is better. I believe, from my perspective, having read this and looking at the science behind it, of saying actually one day we have to give this back.
See, that's Genesis 1:26, which where it says, God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, they will rule, that's the word there, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on it. I found it quite interesting to contrast that, because I don't think there are two accounts of creation, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. And Genesis 2, there's a slightly different emphasis. I'm trying to find the verse, verse 15, where it says, the Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and watch over it, which is a subtly different emphasis, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I disagree with none of that. To work it and watch over it. You know, we're not here to just necessarily kind of... you can speak to certain people, and the more we can go back, the less we can do to the earth, the better in their minds. You know, the more we can just kind of almost hands off and go, let's just give it all back to nature. And almost, there are people I speak to in my field who are quite happy for the human race to be taken off the planet so the planet may recover. I am not one of those people. I believe we was given this as a gift to enjoy God's fruits, to enjoy his creation. That custodianship, I'm going to use that word because it's the one that comes up, and that work it. We have to live off the land. I don't think God has any problem with us working with the planet for our continuation as a species. I have no problems with that at all. As a Christian, I sit here going, okay, but we have a responsibility to the earth. And I think as we go through as well, it's not to get trapped also just in, okay, species are dying, we need to look after wildlife and nature, which is part of the answer. But actually, it's also, we are the species that God placed here to enjoy the earth. We have to find a way of working with it for the benefit of all human beings, because at the end of the day, this is beginning to affect human beings, not just nature.
Which is my middle point, what's happening. So what's actually going on in the world today, and why is it relevant? Because to be perfectly blunt, my life is not, I don't think, massively affected by climate change at the moment, or the changes that are going on globally, because I live in a fairly wealthy, nice part of the world. So why should I be worried about this? I don't see any evidence, except the seasons are not quite as predictable as perhaps they used to be.
And what's on the news, thousands
and
of
what's
miles
on the
away.
news, yeah.
Absolutely.
So what's happening? What's going on in the world today that is an issue, are things that are, if not affecting us now, will be affecting us.
Absolutely, okay. I love the fact that you said I come from a fairly wealthy country. That's really important, actually. If we go back through history, if you want to look where wealth is, it's about on the same line on the globe as where we are. If you trace it around the globe and things like that, it's about, that's where the wealth is. And that's largely based on what we have is what we call a temperate climate. We have seasons. We have sun, we have rain, we have cold, we have snow. And actually that's really good for growing stuff. So when you want a garden, this is about the best place to be. Maybe a little bit south, maybe a bit further. Northern Europe would be even fancier and nicer because it's that little bit warmer. So it's really good. So that's what actually we're after. So for us at the minute, in our temperate zone, we're starting to see changes. We're starting to, when we start look at insects, for example, we're starting to see species that could not survive here, starting to move further north. Because the weather is getting slightly warmer and they can survive through winter. I'm thinking about things like parakeets or the Asian hornet, for anyone who's really into insects. You used to get wiped out every winter. Our seasons are changing ever so slightly. So I'm like you. I have a life that I kind of go, it doesn't affect me all that much. If we start to head south, though, along that equator line, where seasons are not quite as clear as they are in the temperate zone, they have summer pretty much all year round. Yes, it gets colder, but actually it's a fairly stable climate. Going 1 or 2 degrees higher there changes massively. Crops start to fail. Drought happens more often. You get more swarms, you get more plagues going on around. I call them plagues, it's a nice bit of biblical language, but more kind of, locusts in the extreme. And it starts to affect people on that equator line far more than it affects us as nice westernized sort of temperate zone people. That means that there are people now who are going to start having far higher levels of starvation, far higher levels of drought. It's going to start affecting them in ways that are going to catastrophically change the way they live, to the point where that middle line of the earth is going to start requiring people to move out of it. Which you kind of go, okay, it's a big globe. Actually, we're not that big. They're going to start heading northwards, because that's where the crop's going south. If you have a look at the globe, there's very little south of the equator, actually. So they're going to start heading northwards. That means there's a whole host of people who are going to be starving. There's a whole host of people who are going to be hungry. There's a whole, hungry, starving, homeless. They're going to need a lot of care. So actually what we're doing in the world, by consuming and by just having the kind of, doesn't affect me, I'm going to carry on as normal, we're actually threatening and harming people thousands of miles away who are feeling the effects, who are going to have to start finding ways of living very differently to we are now.
Okay, I want to pick up on two words that we've mentioned, wealth and consumer.
Okay.
And when we were talking earlier, you saw those as really important as insights into what the causes of this whole scenario. So do you want to elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, this is where I start getting controversial, folks, I will say that. We are a wealthy country, there's no doubt about it. And you look at the likes of America and you look at the places around, again, that temperate zone around the earth, we have a lot of money. Money tends to say that we can buy things and we can buy what we want when we want to buy it. Who's ever seen an Amazon van driving around? Yeah. I want you to all do a little task. Okay, when you're driving around now, I play a little game. Can I do a journey without seeing an Amazon van? Okay, you can all start playing that game. There's a good reason to say that, because as wealth we can buy what we want. And this is where the climate science starts to come into this discussion, really. The more we buy, the more we have to make. That just makes sense. We all know that. Everything we make has a cost somewhere. Not just monetary cost, but a material cost. Every time we make something, we produce have some form of impact upon the globe. So the big one is plastic at the minute. Everyone knows that when we use plastic and then we throw it away, it does not decompose. It doesn't go away for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we basically there's places in the globe you can go across the Atlantic, and there's the Atlantic garbage dump, as it's known. And it's because of the currents of the Atlantic that just sits there, and it's full of refuge and waste that we don't use. We use once, we get rid of, and that's it. It's done. For us, we put it in our recycling and feel good about ourselves. It ends up somewhere. Equally, every time we drive somewhere, every time we buy something, it takes energy to make that. Therefore, we have to take a resource from somewhere. Our food that we eat, how much of your food, how full is your compost bin at the end of the week before your recycling people come and take it away? All of that has a cost somewhere. So our consumeristic ways, our ways of buying what we want, impacts and hits other people elsewhere. Again, it may be people across the globe somewhere that are actually impacting and being affected by the choices we make. It is my belief that consumerism is climate change. Okay, to tie those two together, the more we use, the more we want, that is what's driving consumerism. There is a very good statistic, even for people like me, who try my best to do all the nice things that are good for the climate. With every time you go up the wealth ladder, your consumerism, your production of CO2 and impacting upon climate change goes up too. The poorer you are, the lower impact you are having. So the people around the middle of the globe, the poorer, they're having less of an impact on the climate, which means it's our responsibility, the wealthy, that have caused the problem and are going to have to solve the problem as well.
Okay.
It does get happier, folks.
I'm trying to think of an example of this that might help it become a bit more real.
Okay.
So one of the questions I would ask is why is the destruction? What's happening in the Amazon? Why is the forest disappearing?
Okay. So why is the forest disappearing? There are some wonderful products in the world that are wonderful to us, and I'm trying to think of something. I'll tell you what, we're on a Sunday. Let's look at the Sunday roast. Okay, we have beef on there usually, or lamb, or something like that. To grow animals takes a lot of land. You need a lot of land to let your animals roam around and eat the grass on. And that, in one way, you kind of go, well, that's great. Very rarely, actually, do we let our beef animals, particularly, roam around a field anymore. Okay, we keep them in sheds. But what we do need, we still need another field to grow their food in. So for one cow, or for a small group of cows, and I realise we've got farmers as well, and I'm not having to go at farming. I think farming is key to the solution of this, actually. We have beef, and then you need somewhere to grow. One of the good things to grow is soy. Now, there's a lot of, anyone vegetarian or vegan? Yeah, okay. Soy's wonderful. It's not. You say it's not, but actually even things like corn mince, those mock burgers, the mock chicken, all that contains soy in there somewhere. And people go, well, vegetarians are just as bad then. 60% of our soy production goes on feeding the animals that we eat. Now, just do the logic in your brain there then. So we're growing crops that grow somewhere around the Amazon. We have to plough under trees. We have to take the trees down, clear out areas, grow the soy to then ship it all the way over to turn it into food, to feed to a cow that then goes on our plate. That's a lot of CO2, a lot of transport, a lot of cost in that. That soy goes into loads of things, and then palm oil goes into loads of things as well. So when we just go, oh, I want my hair to smell lovely again today, we just go, I'll have another shower, and I'll put a bit more of that shampoo on my head. No, I like the one with palm oil in it, so I'll go for that one. We're affecting people in the Amazon. We need to plough down another field to get more soy in there. And then also, well, I'll not go into that because I'll go on for ages. But that sort of thinking, that sort of we just take and we have what we want, has an impact again somewhere else that we need to seriously make choices. And there are choices. I think this is getting into the positivity of this. There will be choices that we'll discuss further down the line that we can make that actually have far less of an impact on that.
So what's if we were to agree that consumerism is not always good?
Yeah.
I say not always good because there's always going to be some level of consumption.
Yes.
So we're always going to consume some things. But if excessive consumerism is no good, what's the answer? What's the counter to that?
So this is where a nice question, thank you. This is where my kind of biblicalness and my Christian perspective comes into climate change. There's a wonderful radio program, slight aside, called What Three Words. I don't necessarily recommend anyone to. It's not Christian at all. And they'll get a celebrity on and they pick 3 words and they discuss what words mean to them. And one of the words that I always think that is most key to this discussion now is contentment, which ties me back into my biblical thinking. Our consumerism ways are we buy stuff because we want it. And we buy it when we want to buy it because we just want to buy it. And I'm sorry, Geoff, I'm a massive fan of books too. Massive fan of books. But do they need to be on your shelf? What's wrong with a library? You can order them in from the library.
Nothing if it's mine.
Exactly that. Nothing of it is mine. We're quite obsessed with that. Now, biblically, one of the things that talks about so much is contentment. And if we're content with what we have, if we're content with what we really need, actually that starts to go a long way towards solving this climate problem. Sorry, I'm not a clothes person. You may notice I've very strategically worn this today. This company, Patagonia, you may notice this symbol. I wear them borderline religiously. I have no particular on that one. Their company motto is, do not buy our clothes. So why have I bought them? Essentially, they say you do not buy our clothes until you have none left in your cupboard that you can wear anymore. So this one particularly, I'm quite proud of it. None of you can see it, can you? I made a massive hole, well, not massive, a finger-sized hole in it a while back. And they run a scheme where you can say, right, I'll send it back and get it repaired, or I'll repair it myself. Just to make another T-shirt takes lots of CO2, takes lots of farming, take lots of all that kind of stuff. And it's saying, actually, some of you will be very happy with the make, do and mend mentality. That kind of solution of, if we can get back to a way it says, does it need renewing? Am I happy with what I've got in life? Am I responsible with what I've got in life? And do I see it reflecting on good choices that fit with the wider context of the earth? I actually think we start ends up in an interesting theological place to say, how do we marry our Christian belief to our worldview of how can we actually start to make inroads into this?
There's a couple of things that have come to my mind thinking about this. The first is, I'm remembering when we were talking earlier, and I was saying about how, you know, a lot of these problems have come about. My perception was post the Industrial Revolution, and Dave said very clearly to me, no, it was the rise of wealth.
Yeah.
It was the fact that from the Industrial Revolution we had the money then to be able to do what we wanted to do and go where we want to go, and that's where we've seen an expansion of global travel, we've seen an expansion of buying stuff, accumulating stuff, etc. And the disparity starts to come in of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Contrasted in my head with a biblical, theological concept. You find, there's a couple of things that you find throughout the whole of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, the idea that the earth is the Lord's, to quote the psalmist. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Psalm 24 verse 1. And this understanding that we as God's people are living in God's land.
Correct.
That's a very big principle. And it comes out in the Old Testament in the principle of Jubilee, where every 7 years, economically there was a reset button. If you had struggled in those 7 years and had to sell your land, bearing in mind most people then, well, it was agricultural living, and had to sell your land, at the end of that 7 years, at the year of Jubilee, you were given it all back. So there was a reset in the whole system, that everybody started again with the same amount of money or wealth as they had at the beginning of the 7 years. So whether you prospered or whether you got poorer through that journey, at the end of it there was a reset button. And this was the theory anyway, not that it ever quite worked out in practice. But the principle God was putting in, and we see in the Bible, is that the rich are not rich for their own sake, but there is this responsibility. The rich have a responsibility to care for those who are in need. And we find this over and over and over again in Scripture. In the New Testament, there's an awful lot where Jesus said some really challenging things. I think it's Luke chapter 6, where Jesus says, if someone wants to take your coat, give them your shirt as well. Obviously, the idea is if you've got and someone else is in need, there's an element of where you share, you give. There's the principle in Acts chapter 4, isn't it, where the believers as a church come together, and it said those who have resources sold them to provide for the needs of those who were the most poorest. And there's this idea of not just contentment. I perhaps we want to go a bit more than contentment and say generosity. Absolutely. That's a big counter to this whole consumerist mentality. I think whilst I kind of got that in my head, how are we subtly consumerist and not realising it? Is kind of
how we subtly consumerist.
So one of the things you were talking about was cars.
Oh yeah, cars. we cars have changed massively. I mean, and it's really interesting speaking to you guys differently, coming from a different generation. Because you probably sat there going, well, yeah, we're just going back to what we were like a few years ago. And actually, coming back to that point just right where you started, that existence of wealth, that real production of wealth, we go, oh, the CO2 thing, the fossil fuel thing goes back to industrial age, as you say. Most of the CO2 in the air now has been produced since 1970. So 1970 to now, far more CO2 has gone into the atmosphere than has ever gone in history. Okay, so that's I am coming to where you're coming to with this. So that means that somehow something has happened that's caused this spike, and it is wealth and consumerism. So if we are responsible for God's planet and trying to think along that, when we come to things like cars, when we come to things like clothes, when we come to things like TVs, how many do you need? Okay? Now when you go, well, we need two, because I go one way and I go somewhere else. And probably in the most busy moment of my life, in terms of kids clubs, in terms of where we're going and things like that, we have one car consciously, because it forces us to walk again. Now, again, I know not everybody is at that point. It forces us to use public transport if we need to, because we have cars because we can. We can have two cars. So cars, for example, are becoming very disposable. You have them for 3 years and then they go somewhere else. And it's someone else's problem when it goes wrong. It drives me around the bend and I can't open up a car and fix it anymore. Really drives me around the bend. I've literally just had to have my car done and I could see the pipe, but I couldn't fix it because if I did, something on my computer somewhere would go wrong. So we've become very kind of, we can have two cars, so we'll have two cars. Subconsciously, I don't think anyone's going, well, I don't care about that. It just makes life easier. Part of that thought, and I think that's where you're going with the program, is it just makes life easier. I want to quiz you as Christians, and that thought of, are we affecting someone thousands of miles away? It's very easy to see your neighbour in trouble. What about your global neighbour around? Are our choices disregarding those? And how much are you willing to suffer for someone else's gain? I don't mean financial gain. I mean for their well-being, for their health, for their food, for their choices. This is the thing that goes through my head all the time. How much am I willing to suffer in my westernized wealth, in a society that says consumerism is good, buy the new sofa, buy the new car? How much am I willing to rebel against that and say, well, actually no, because that affects my brother and sister in the middle of the equator? Hopefully that's where he was trying to lead out. This is where the question of Christianity and how our responsibility is as globally part of a Christian family and as God's creation starts to really change in my head. Go, what are our responsibilities and where can we go with this?
I mean, that is exactly what I was thinking about, the power of choice. One of the things you said in our discussion was, am I willing to limit myself for the benefit of another? I thought that was a really, theologically, really important question, because time and time again in the Bible you come across examples of care for one another, look out for one another, love one another, think about the other person. It's there over and over again. Care for the poor, care for the widows. It's there over and over. In Acts we hear about the Paul raising funds in one area of Europe to send aid to the Middle East because they were undergoing a famine and a time of need. So there are wonderful biblical examples of caring for others and the importance of that, of an expression of Christian love. I think one of the things that I've been wrestling with as we've had our conversations over the last few weeks is how far does this go in our lives? Because I think we all know that we're meant to be kind, loving people, and we all know that it's our choice whether we are like that. But realistically, I mean, are you realistically saying that you think as Christians we should restrict ourselves, give up some of our rights for the benefit of another? Okay.
This is where I get Your right is an interesting one.
Yeah.
If everything is God's and God's within it, isn't your right to do what you want to do with it? Would be where I'd start with that one. I am realistically saying that, yes. Don't like it in the negative language of we should be challenged to give, or are we realistically saying we should limit ourselves? From my perspective and where I've come to with this, Christianity and climate change in hand, I honestly see this as an opportunity as Christians to spread the message of God across the globe. I genuinely see this as an opportunity. We are, as a family of Christians across the globe, an amazing force. If there is a war, if there is a famine, if there's a natural disaster, guess who turn up first? The Christians. We always turn up first. We always get there with food supplies, with what's necessary, because we are a family globally. We always turn up first. That's a witness. That's a real charge as the army of God moving forward, going, God loves you, God cares for you. When you're hungry, we'll feed you. When you're sick, we'll look after you. We'll take care of you. And we do that really well. At the minute, climate change-wise, I see it as an opportunity to do the same again. What if we turn up first? There's a brilliant book I've just been recommended. I haven't read it all yet, but it's called Who Owns Britain, or Who Owns England? And a large landowner is the church. What could we use that for to help? Could we plant trees on it? Could we make farming to help our neighbours here around us? Could we use that as some form of global companies will pay to plant trees so that they can invest their carbon while we're trying to sort out how we do it? What could we use that money for? How could we send that money? Where could we send that money? Who could we feed with that money? I see this as a huge opportunity for the church. What if the church turns up and goes, we believe what's going on in the earth, the way we are using the earth is not the way God intended. And as we use it in the way that God intended, look how it gets better. There are as many examples of things working well as there are for bad. Well, probably not as many, but there are many ways of showing if we can manage the earth well, how quickly it comes back, how quickly God will restore things. And I mean that. I believe that when there's lots and lots of initiatives that are started by governments across the world, and I'm thinking about forestry particularly because that's my particular area of expertise, where they try and manage it in a way that suits a financial goal at the end of it, shall we say that. That often comes at the costs of local people, of people in the Amazon, for example. Often comes at the cost of them. So some research has been said, well, we'll buy the land and then we'll hand it back to local people. And there's this kind of, well, no, they'll take stuff out of it. They'll take the trees that we want. It's amazing when you give custodianship back to local people. It has been shown categorically you end up with a better forest at the end of it. So what could we use that money for? Could we fund people to actually manage and be custodians of the forest the way it was intended? Well, you know, in the UK, we're not going to have much of a forest. We're extremely small. But actually, we have a lot of land that we have the wealth to fund other places that we could have the opportunity to really try and improve it. That comes at a cost of us making a choice of what do we do with what's ours, in inverted commas, ours. Is any of it ours?
See, I'm not aware or I'm not clued into climate type issues really. Mm-hmm. What I can tell you is about mission.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm very much aware of, the Western church, so if you think of the Western church in the Western world, 90% of our money is spent on ourselves. Mm-hmm. Probably not over 95%. So we struggle to give away more than 10% of our wealth. Mm-hmm. That's been the statistic in the church for decades, in the Western church. So I do kind of half connect with your comment about the fact that we are wealthy and we have opportunities to do things to impact our world. I think one of the things that occurred to me recently as I was meditating, thinking, trying to work out what we were going to do today. Some people may remember a couple of decades ago, there was quite a discussion about the idea of common good. One of the champions of the idea of common good was a certain Bishop of Liverpool, who wrote quite a lot about it and advocated for the common good. This idea of common good is that as believers, as Christians, we should not live for ourselves, but we should live for the common good of all. And I was reflecting, thinking, you're just advocating for the same thing using different words.
Yep.
Aren't you?
Yeah, basically. And I find the 10%, I'll be honest with you, I've not always tied 10%. At a minute, I'm probably economically in the worst place I've ever been. But I find the tithe a really interesting place when it comes to this. I believe it was ours to tithe. I believe that. I believe 10% is a minimum target, not a maximum. I believe that as Christians, if we've got wealth, then that wealth should not be in our pockets, in our bank accounts. So that's what I believe. I don't believe it was the church's responsibility to then tithe the tithe. I believe that the money given as a tithe was to benefit those around us. That the church was an action for good, that tithe comes to us, and that is then used to serve the community as a wider. I think we now live in a wealth category, that the community has got bigger, and that the church is responsible with that money and that what they do, to do good. And I think that's when we come to common good. The idea that what is ours, that tithe that comes to us, how do we use that? How do we then take that money and say, well, where does our community end? Where does our neighbour end? And I know I'm in no way trying to say that every penny we get should go on the climate. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm trying to shift in people's brains and what I kind of evangelise about in terms of climate change is about people. That if we don't solve climate change, people are in real trouble. People are suffering, and people are harmed and are starving, etc. And I just say our neighbourhood's got bigger. We've got neighbours further afield now that we need to concern ourselves from. Yes, we need to help our neighbours, in our physical neighbours, in our communities around us. But let's not just narrow it to say our responsibility here is here. Let's look at this as the church, meaning the Church of Christ, the global Church of Christ. How do we use our funds, our resources? How do we change our mentality as Christians to say, actually, can I live biblically in line more by being more content, by being more giving, by being more generous, by being more hopeful? I honestly believe we have the power of God behind us in this. I honestly believe that whatever the church invests its money in, globally, will have a greater impact than any other scheme going. I believe the power of God's within it. And if we do that at a global scale, then the common good becomes Christ-centered, becomes God-centered, and becomes a witness as a global witness, not just a local community witness.
I'm conscious of time, and we need to wrap this up, but kind of want to again just reflect a little bit on some of the things that we've talked about, some of the things that we've hopefully been thinking about. I find it very easy to not think about these issues and just to get on with my life. I think it's very challenging to say we have a role to play in this, we have a responsibility. Maybe recycling that plastic bottle does make a difference. Maybe choosing not to replace my TV with a new one will make a difference. I noticed on the news this morning there was an interesting discussion about how clothing industry is being challenged at the moment because of the way in which people are buying what they are now referring to as pre-loved or pre-owned. And I find that fascinating. I know it's second-hand.
Second-hand, yeah, absolutely.
But stuff that's good quality, that's just there, and instead of being thrown away, can be reused. Maybe maybe we need to be champions for that type of thing. Maybe we need to start turning our plugs off at the sockets a bit more. Save us some money as well as saving some energy. Maybe we do need to think about what we do and what we don't do in terms of holidays. I found that discussion, which we had a little discussion about holidays. I found that really interesting. How do we justify our expense in terms of these things when we look at it in a global context? But bring it back to faith and to God. Why should we be people who are concerned about this? I want to just end with one of my thoughts to end with is Matthew 25, where Jesus is talking about the coming kingdom, when the king will return. And the thing that I find most challenging about Matthew 25 is Jesus is saying very clearly, we will be measured by what we do. And he says this: you'll be blessed if, and then I'm quoting Jesus, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. I found that quite challenging, because in terms of the changes that are happening in our world, poverty, drought, migration are the first three on that list. Poverty, drought and migration are the first things on that list that Jesus is going to measure us by in what we respond to. I find that really quite challenging, and that for me is what makes this really important. On a positive note, we can do this. The church globally has been responsible for the rise of education around the world, for the improvement of medication and healthcare globally, for raising 50% of people out of global poverty over the last half a century. That's what the church has done. In the last 2 generations, the church has made a huge impact globally in this world. Massive difference. So doing more is possible. If you look at it on that big global level, the church globally has a huge opportunity to make real change. Are we prepared to actually love the neighbour, to love the other person? And are we prepared to do that even when it costs us something?
Absolutely.
That's my summary.
May I summarise on a positive? I realise I sound like a right harbinger of doom, and I really don't. I honestly want to say this is doable. Change is going to happen. We're too far down the road. Change is going to happen. But I like the thought that we can do something and act upon something to change it back to the way God intended. I believe God wants to partner with us, not to just solve it all for us. I honestly have a true, why are we saved if he's not there wanting to willingly work with us on a whole manner of things? And I know I've kind of said, oh, this, that and the other. Agriculture is changing. There are ways that they're talking, something, if you're a farmer, go and look at regenerative agriculture. It's an amazing, and it's kind of going back to, and I say I smile because it's going back to 1940s Britain in many ways of how we use the land and how we grow the land. It's an amazing thing. The way we heat our homes and challenge ourselves. Technology is not the enemy. It's how do we use it and how do we as people drive that forwards and make the choices. I think in the global climate change and what is coming in the years forwards, I believe all those gifts that we're given as Christians can be used, wisdom to make the right choices. You know, that kind of choosing to drive policy change through the choices we make. Those kind of action, those people who have the feet and the hands to going out there and demonstrating how we can look after God's world, prosper a generation and prosper a people. I believe it is all possible. I really believe it's all possible, and I really want to be positive on that. I speak bluntly about a lot of the statistics because I think as Christians, We have to make the right choice now for the future generations coming. And who knows, the Lord may come tomorrow. I don't know. But I just would like him to turn up and the place be in shape. I just think it would be really nice. And on that, there's a little book that I recommend anyone reading. It's The Man Who Planted Trees. It's not a Christian book. It's a very short book. It's only about 30 or 40 pages long. And it's about a man who's wandering through a very desolate place. And I'll summarise it very quickly. Very desolate, pre-war, pre-First World War. And he comes across a man, and he's thirsty. The guy's walking, he's really thirsty. And this man takes him, and he puts him in his house. And that evening when they're sat in his house, this man's sorting seeds out. And the tree seeds. And the next day he goes out and he sticks a stick in the ground, makes a hole, drops the seed into it, pushes it over, and he walks on. And he does this all day long. That's all he does. And then the war hits, and this man has to disappear to the First World War. And he comes back and finds him again. And the story continues. That happens again. The Second World War breaks. Anyway, it ends up that the trees have grown, and the valley is restored, and the water systems are restored, and there's a village, and there's people living there again. And it's a very nice picture, but there's a little bit in it that strikes me. And I honestly think this is, for me, where my brain sits. It's only a paragraph long. It just says, the oaks of 1910 were then 10 years old, and taller than either of us. It was an impressive spectacle. I was literally speechless, and as he did not talk, we spent the whole day walking in silence through his forest. In 3 sections it measured 11 kilometres in length and 3 kilometres at its greatest width. When you remembered that all of this had sprung from the hands and the soil of this one man, without technical resources, you understood that men could be as effectual as God in realms other than destruction. I think that's the hope of Christianity. We have the hope to demonstrate God. We have the hope to demonstrate his kingdom through climate change, through feeding the poor, feeding the hungry, housing those without homes. I honestly believe we're in a point of real possible change and hope, and I'll end with that.
Okay.